It's less of a magic lamp and more like a monkey's paw. It's the Aladdin Deck Enhancer on NES Works Gaiden episode 17. This week brings us another NES Works Gaiden, another patron request, and another focus on European exclusives. Well, sort of. Comerica's Aladdin Deck Enhancer was definitely released in the US, but it's entirely possible that you never actually saw it at retail.
Comerica's creation arrived under unlicensed, not to mention unhappy, circumstances. Because it wasn't officially sanctioned by Nintendo of America, its distribution was spotty at best. Nintendo's grip on US retail distribution had slipped considerably from its 1989-1990 peak by the time Aladdin made its debut in 1992, but most retailers were still anxious not to cross Nintendo too blatantly. Selling gray market NES goods, games that were legally produced by third parties but not manufactured or authorized for distribution by Nintendo themselves, was a quick way to tick them off. Comerica in particular had cemented itself as a nemesis for the console maker by producing the Game Genie hacking device. Designed to allow players to modify their game experiences by intercepting and redefining software code en route to the CPU, the Game Genie could be made to provide infinite lives in difficult games, supply infinite ammo, weaken enemies, or even make games harder. And Nintendo hated it. The company tried its best to seek legal remedy against the Game Genie, but the courts decided in Comerica's favor. Flush with victory, the rebel publisher quickly devised a companion for the Genie, Aladdin, and proceeded to run itself straight into bankruptcy. Like the Game Genie, the Aladdin was a hardware device designed to slip into the NES's cartridge slot and act as an interface between cart and console. The difference between Game Genie and Aladdin is that the former was designed to work with existing carts, while the latter was made to allow Comerica's own carts to run on the console. The Aladdin exploited one of the more interesting physical features of NES software, their multi-chip design. When Masayuki Uemura designed the family computer hardware in the early 80s, he had the foresight to realize a console designed to run a 1981 arcade game wasn't going to be particularly competitive in the long run. So he and his team designed the cartridge spec to be modular and expandable. An NES cart actually contains multiple chips inside, including the PRG program code that tells the game how to work, the CHR code that contains graphics, a chip to shake hands with the console's 10 NES security lockout device, and chips to add additional memory to the console's built-in RAM and manage the use of that extra capacity. Depending on the cart, there might also be additional chips, such as a storage manager for battery backup, or even, in the case of some more advanced Japanese chips, an entire separate audio processor module. An engineer by the name of Richard Darling, who worked at Comerica, or rather, at UK-based Codemasters, for whom Comerica was simply the overseas arm, Codemasters America, looked at this setup and had a brainstorm. What if, he realized, we could find a way to remove the universal chips from each individual cart? The chips in an NES cart contributed significantly to their manufacturing costs, and therefore their retail price, especially the memory modules. If you could find a way to make a cart work without needing to include those standard chips each time, you could save the consumer a lot of money by not charging them for redundant components.
And so the Aladdin Deck Enhancer, a cart-shaped device designed to sit in the NES's cartridge slot. It wasn't a game though, and on its own, it couldn't actually do anything. Instead, Aladdin functioned as a sort of dock that allowed access to other games. Comerica developed a custom miniature NES cartridge format that would actually sit in and snap inside the Aladdin Deck Enhancer. In theory.
Despite being on half-size carts, Aladdin games were normal NES software. Comerica's carts didn't need to be full-sized, however, because they only contained about a quarter of the chips of a normal NES game, the program and graphics code. The other chips were contained in the Aladdin itself, 8 kilobytes of RAM, a custom memory mapper, a chip to defeat the 10S lockout, and other mundane behind-the-scenes type modules. The Aladdin basically contained the nervous system of an NES game, while the mini-carts contained its brain. This wasn't a wholly original idea. In fact, over in Japan, Bandai had come up with the same idea in parallel to Comerica with the Detach Joint ROM system for Famicom, which we'll look at sometime in the future. Nintendo would jump into this game-in-a-game market as well in 1994 with the Super Game Boy, which had an entire portable system in a cartridge. Still, it was a solid plan by Comerica. The Aladdin's capabilities were essentially on par with the official MMC3 mapper chip, the single most popular NES memory format. And many of the games demonstrate that singular European instinct for sharp animation and high-energy, rave-style chiptunes. making for games that look and sound pretty impressive despite being packed into tiny carts. This format should have been a huge victory for Comerica. It allowed its programmers and designers to work around a capable, standardized technical spec, while drastically cutting prices on the actual software for the consumer's benefit. And they would have gotten away with it too if it weren't for you pesky market realities. By 1992, the NES's fortunes had definitely begun to wane in the US, as players upgraded to Sega Genesis and Super NES. Had the Aladdin shipped in, say, 1990, it would have found a far more fertile retail environment. Arriving as late as it did, the selection of retailers willing to carry unlicensed NES products were less enthusiastic about NES products in general, and Comerica's grand scheme fell afoul of the greatest concern of all. No one really cared. The wet fizzle that was the Aladdin scuppered Comerica's fortunes, and the company soon shut down. Codemasters, however, did not. They're still trucking along as a publisher, and many of the games produced or announced for Aladdin also shipped on standard unlicensed NES carts, which, with one exception, are 100% identical to their Aladdin versions. So in the end, what did the Aladdin accomplish? Not a lot, unless you consider corporate Darwinism a valuable end goal in and of itself. The Aladdin and its games were produced in modest quantities, but as it sold poorly, many of these units still exist as unopened new old stock. You can still purchase the complete set, the deck and its 6 separate game releases, for around $120, or what the collection would have sold for new. The deck itself can be a little tricky to use on anything but original hardware. The system gave emulator writers troubles for ages, and even now clone consoles tend to choke when asked to run games off the Aladdin. That includes Analog's NT Mini, which I use as the core of my video recording setup, and which can handle more than 99% of the NES library without even blinking. While several of these games do run fine on the NT Mini, many of them glitch out within the first few minutes, usually at the same spots, which leads me to suspect the issue has to do with the memory management. Even so, I've spent a couple of afternoons running through the Aladdin library to provide a complete rundown of the library, the good, the bad, and the vast expanse of mediocrity.
As unlicensed NES releases go, Comerica's actually sit up in the upper tiers, with some of their best games rating up there right alongside Tingid's best releases.
In fact, there are a couple of Aladdin titles that are better than 90% of the licensed NES library. They all feel undeniably European, but they make a much better showing for themselves than just about anything Beam or Ocean barfed up for the console under license. You just really need to like ambulatory eggs.
Yes, that's right. The Oliver twins' perennial picaresque protagonist, the ovular omelet adventurer Dizzy, is practically the Aladdin's mascot character, appearing in no less than 2 1/4 of the system's 7 releases.
Dizzy is one of those video game phenomena that betray a player's heritage. If you know Dizzy, you are from England. The rest of the world has only experienced Dizzy passively, like sitting too close to a smoker. Dizzy the Adventurer, the pack-in title for the Aladdin, speaks to the sheer proliferation of the franchise. It's a top-to-bottom remake of the 10th game in the series, Dizzy Prince of the Yolkvolk. It would also be the last original Dizzy title created by the Oliver twins until 2011. Dizzy the Adventurer is an extremely British game. It betrays its microcomputer heritage straight away. The game world plays out screen by screen with no scrolling, and every single screen has its own location name. Dizzy looks like he should be a platform action hero, and he does run and jump, but twitch reflex has very little place in this work. It's absolutely an adventure game in which our hero sets out to rescue his endlessly abducted girlfriend by walking around, picking up items to be used in different places, juggling his inventory, and dodging bad guys, against which he is largely defenseless. Dizzy the Adventurer is by far the best of Dizzy's 3 appearances on Aladdin. It feels the most sophisticated and refined, with a proper inventory management system and a lot of character dialogue to add some personality to the world. It starts with a nice little interactive bit that functions transparently as a tutorial. Dizzy comes to in a room barred by a wooden door, which also contains straw, a match, and a bucket of water. This is pretty rudimentary as puzzles go, but it forces you to come to terms with the inventory system and also teaches you that you'll lose a life if you catch yourself on fire. Unfortunately, Dizzy the Adventurer is also unstable on my setup. The screen with the drifting boat always causes the game to crash. It's a shame because this is a perfectly charming little adventure that I would sincerely play more of in my own free time.
Dizzy also appears on the Quattro Adventures cartridge, a 4-in-1 compilation of game chunklets that aren't quite substantial or meaty enough to exist on their own. This includes Treasure Island Dizzy, by far the worst of the Aladdin Dizzy games.
Treasure Island Dizzy, unlike Dizzy the Adventurer, feels like an older work that cleaves a little more closely to the philosophy of microcomputer games. You only get a single life here, and death comes quickly and without warning, sometimes from off-screen. Sometimes you'll even die just by walking and jumping on seemingly normal ground. And the second you die, that's it. You go back to the start and have to redo the game from the beginning, retracing your linear steps through the world, which means it doesn't take long to get really tired of lugging that boulder over to the cliff to the left to serve as a stepping stone. To Treasure Island Dizzy's credit, it's not as bad as Boomerang Kid, a terrible attempt at an action game. Despite featuring some fairly decent NES caliber animation, the game makes use of an extremely dated arcade game physics model. When you step off a platform here, there's no inertia to your movement, you just plummet straight down like a rock. And if you fall more than about twice the height of your character, you die horribly and instantly. Somewhat more tolerable is Linus Spacehead, a simple platformer with a daring opening. Linus begins at the bottom of the ocean, and you're forced to navigate a stream of rising bubbles in order to reach the surface before your air runs out. That's pretty harsh for a first stage. If you manage to make your way to the surface, Linus Spacehead becomes a typical scrolling action game in which you collect collectibles and jump jumpable enemies while leaping across leapable platforms. Like Treasure Island Dizzy, a single misstep or collision equals death, and you have only a single life, so the overall Linus Spacehead experience amounts to replaying the rising bubble sequence over and over again. The best thing on the cart ultimately is Super Robin Hood. Created by Dizzy's fathers, the Oliver twins, Super Robin Hood is not a graphical adventure masquerading as an action game, it is just a platform shooter, and a reasonably convincing one at that. You play as Robin Hood, navigating a series of castle rooms and avoiding hazards while taking out bad guys with your bow and arrow. There's a little bit of wind-up time on firing an arrow, which forces you to approach combat with a hint of strategy, and you can't shoot and duck at the same time. On top of that, Robin Hood actually has health points and can pick up hearts to heal damage, which makes for a more forgiving and enjoyable play experience than the utterly unforgiving one-hit kill approach that just about every other Comerica game in this episode uses. Sadly, this is one of those games that doesn't seem to want to work correctly on clone hardware even with fixed ROMs, so it will remain out of reach to me for the time being. Somehow I'm sure I'll survive.
The other Aladdin multi-cart release, Quattro Sports, is, as the name suggests, a collection of 4 sports games. There's no stylistic connection between these 4 games, it's just 4 small sports games that Comerica knew it couldn't sell individually.
Quattro Sports originally debuted in 1990 as a standard NES unlicensed cart, so this was basically the greatest hits reissue, except, for a game that wasn't a hit. The 4 titles on offer here are all quite excitingly named: Tennis Simulator, BMX Simulator, Soccer Simulator, and Baseball Pros. There's lots of simulation here, not so much stimulation. Honestly, there's a pretty high level of visual polish on display in this game, and some hyperactive chiptune music, of course. It's good enough that I could honestly envision this collection making a pretty strong impression on players in its original 1990 release. Still, the only title of real note here is BMX Simulator, which actually bears the real BMX license. They couldn't bother with a Nintendo license, but somehow had the cash for BMX? Though in fairness, I have to assume that cost a whole lot less than a third-party Nintendo license in 1990. This cart seems especially susceptible to crashing on clone hardware, but what I've been able to play suggests perfectly competent, though not at all inspiring, adaptations of each of these sports. Checking off the boxes, basically.
But wait, we're not quite done with Dizzy yet. Fantastic Adventures of Dizzy is basically the halfway point between Treasure Island Dizzy and Dizzy the Adventurer.
It's a bigger, more expansive game than Treasure Island, and it also isn't nearly as punishing. You get 3 lives rather than 1, and you can even earn 1-ups by completing sliding block puzzles. However, it doesn't have the full inventory screen seen in Dizzy the Adventurer, nor is there NPC interaction or dialogue to provide context for your quest. It feels more like a pure platform action game, though it does still require Dizzy to pick up and transport items. This being the 3rd Dizzy title for the platform, it's pretty much business as usual. In fact, it contains quite a few scenes and puzzles which are repurposed from previous Dizzy titles, though I can't imagine most Americans would have realized that at the time. Perhaps the most notable thing about the game is that it actually features some degree of scrolling rather than consisting of a string of standalone screens, making it feel more like an actual NES game than a computer conversion. The other interesting thing about Fantastic Adventures is that it had debuted as a standalone cart in 1991, and unique among the carts repurposed for Aladdin, it actually received a sizable upgrade in making its way to the system. While the original cart contained 100 of the stars you need to collect to achieve full completion, the Aladdin release gets 250. I guess if more Dizzy is a compelling prospect for you, this is the Dizzy to get.
Arguably the most impressive Aladdin release, Micro Machines is another mini-cart conversion of an existing software title. This one originally released in 1991.
I recall this one commanding a fair bit of hype back in the day. Back in the days when Game Informer was a slim freebie you got with Funko orders, Micro Machines netted a huge spread in the book's debut issue. Though it's not as though Game Informer was especially choosy about topics back in its early days. Skepticism aside, Micro Machines actually is a pretty excellent game. After playing through a fair few lousy top-down racers for Game Boy over the years, Micro Machines is a pleasant breath of fresh air. It controls well, and the difficulty balance waits until the second set of levels before becoming punishingly hard, giving players lots of opportunities for trial and error. The game's visuals and animation are both top of the class for NES, with lots of attention poured into the movement of a variety of different vehicles and environments. Best of all, Micro Machines absolutely makes the most of its license. The races are built around the concept of playing with a set of Galoob's miniature Micro Machines, the tiny collectible toy cars that exploded quickly into popularity in the late 80s thanks to a series of memorable, fast-talking TV commercials. Micro Machines plays up the property's nature in two notable ways. First, every race puts you in control of a different Micro Machine toy with the premise that every time you win, you get to add that car to your collectible box. A perfect game results in a complete shadow box set, including that intriguing but hard to acquire monster truck to fill the box space at the bottom right. It's sort of like a trophy set, but one that reflects the collectible nature of the license, and no doubt inspired a bit of covetousness among players. The other success here is in the nature of the racetracks. You don't race on actual tracks, but rather in makeshift, domestic, real-world scenarios. What looks like a beach is actually a waterlogged sandbox, complete with children's half-submerged footprints and random bits of junk. The first level sees you racing on a tabletop through a course loosely defined by a pathway of breakfast cereal pieces. It's extremely clever, and it gives the game a unique personality while also justifying some of the more outlandish hazards and challenges. Players are given a wide selection of characters of different ethnicities and genders to play as, but you also get to pick your rivals. As other racers lose against you, they retire from the game and you choose their replacement, until you've completed all the courses and knocked out all your opponents. Perhaps not surprisingly, Micro Machines would become an ongoing franchise for Codemasters. The most recent entry in the franchise appeared on modern platforms in 2017. This release also hinted at the company's larger future. Codemasters is best known these days for their polished racing games. On the whole, this is probably the one Aladdin release that looked to the future rather than the past.
Well, I suppose that's not entirely true. Big Nose Freaks Out is neither forward nor backward facing. It's a game focused wholly on its moment in time, which is to say, the rise of Sonic the Hedgehog.
This is a game that appears to have been thrown together in haste following the gangbuster success of Sonic on Genesis in the summer of 1991. As with so many Sonic come-latelys, of course, it's nowhere near as good as the real thing. Big Nose contains both Sonic's speedy movement across ramps and platforms, and its emphasis on poking around in search of collectibles. It does a pretty poor job with both of these tasks, however, and it makes a lot of mistakes that keep it from being particularly enjoyable. As in Sonic, protagonist Big Nose dies instantly upon contact with monsters or hazards, but he can insulate himself against damage by acquiring the proper collectible. He can only carry one of these objects at a time, rather than hundreds, and they don't go spilling out of his possession when he gets slugged in the face. He just changes color from brown to yellow. Since the NES hardware couldn't really handle the kind of lively, multi-tiered level layouts and destructible and moving objects as the Genesis in the hands of Yuji Naka could, Big Nose Freaks Out is a much more constrained experience overall. It moves at a reasonable clip when you're wheeling around on tree branches, but the jumping controls for dodging foes are a bit stiff, so you need to get about with, as they say, an abundance of caution. Enemies are kind of dumb and carelessly placed, but they still pose a threat since the game is a little clumsy and you can easily get moving too quickly to spot a monster in time to dodge it. But it's not like you actually spend that much of the game zipping around, because Big Nose Freaks Out wants you to poke around and explore in order to find the many pickups contained throughout the game. It tracks your acquisitions and gives you a report at the end of each stage, presumably to goad you into trying again for a perfect score. But to be completely honest, I can't think of anything that would make me ever want to go for a perfect score. Collectibles are tucked in annoying, inconvenient, out-of-the-way places. Playing Big Nose as intended is a pretty miserable experience. It wants to be Sonic the Hedgehog, but it's more like playing Sonic the Hedgehog on one of those awful AT Games clone consoles with a busted controller.
Thankfully, rounding up the Aladdin lineup is the genuinely enjoyable, if not 100% perfect, sequel to Linus Spacehead.
The original game was simply a platformer with some slightly frustrating physics. Linus has a habit of performing multiple jumps if you hold down the jump button too long, but only on certain surfaces, and many tricky jumps rely on you understanding how Linus will do a slight run-up on the lip of platforms if you fall short. The sequel stretches a bit and tries to top Dizzy at its own game. It retains plenty of platform action, but there's also a dash of adventure game here. Rather than playing as a simple walk up and press the button to collect item adventure a la Dizzy, Linus Spacehead instead takes its cues from Sierra and LucasArts Adventures. The opening scene of the game sets your expectations. You begin in Lino Town and move Linus around with a cursor rather than the D-pad, interacting with objects via a menu palette. You guide your cursor with the NES D-pad, and a status bar at the bottom of the screen provides pop-up text to indicate which elements on screen can be interacted with. The status bar also contains dialogue when you speak to other characters. To simplify the interface for consoles, you can also use the B button to cycle through action verbs. Commands in Cosmic Crusade make use of the menu verb plus object interactive syntax Lucasfilm Games popularized with their Scum Engine games, and having the ability to run rapidly through all possible verbs with the press of a button means you don't need to spend most of your time repeatedly dragging the cursor between the action scene and the menu bar to perform adventure game action. Cosmic Crusade also greatly simplifies the dialogue-based puzzle-solving aspect of its adventure scenes by automating the act of giving. For example, in order to acquire a passport, you first need a passport photo. But once you have that photo, you simply need to speak to the passport agent to hand it over, rather than shuffling through your inventory to find the photo and choosing the give command. You do still need the individual commands, as many puzzles aren't simply dialogue-based. For example, in order to pass the big green monster in the Wasteland region, you need to actively give it a red balloon. That won't happen automatically. This gives Cosmic Crusade a breezy pace that feels well suited for a console, which is surprising since the game made its debut on Amiga and Atari ST. Comerica did a great job of converting the game to this new target platform, making a lot of really smart design and interface choices. It also looks pretty nice, with clean cartoonish graphics and bold solid color selections throughout the world. The dialogue is sparse but clever, and puzzle solutions seem intuitive and can be amusing. There's a lot of great subtle detail too. For example, once you make your way past the big green monster, it'll show up as a new, tiny detail hovering over the wasteland on the world map. Speaking of which, the world map is a great example of the considerate design you see throughout Cosmic Crusade as well. The adventure scenes can afford to be less obtuse than you would normally expect in this kind of game, because the real challenge of Cosmic Crusade comes from the action sequences. In order to move from one area of the world to the next, you need to traverse the same kind of action sequences seen in the original Linus Spacehead. These make use of many of the same gimmicks and quirky physics, which can take some getting used to. Linus himself is helpless against monsters, so these stages are all about mastering the stubborn jump controls while dodging monsters. If you had to traverse these levels every time you move from one area to another, the game would quickly become one of the most grueling slogs imaginable. Thankfully, once you complete an action stage, it's considered conquered, and when you backtrack you simply see Linus scurry across a world map that shows the relative placement of different locations and offers a hint of the scale for the overall adventure. It's not a perfect game because you do have a limited number of lives, and it can be super frustrating to make a good deal of progress in the adventure scenes only to run out of lives by hitting a particularly vexing platform challenge. There is a password feature to allow you to record your progress, however, and collecting tin batteries in the action stages rewards you with an extra life. Overall, Linus Spacehead's Cosmic Crusade is easily the best thing to hit the Aladdin besides perhaps Micro Machines. It's definitely one of the better NES adventure games, even if it never received Nintendo's official sanction.
As for the Aladdin itself, it's a clever idea that didn't quite pan out due to poor timing, distribution challenges in the Nintendo rules the world era of gaming, and the lack of software franchises that were familiar to anyone outside of the UK. The concept itself takes advantage of the unique nature of cartridges, and it's a concept that would be explored more completely with Super Game Boy a few years later. Ultimately, Aladdin is more of a historic relic than anything else, and it's one whose physical design actually gets in the way of being able to revisit it. Still, it's a nice idea, if one that didn't quite pan out.